So my presentation today is on Big Data Resume, which is a splashy way of just talking about talent analytics. And I specifically focused on hiring and how companies are kind of using big data and hyperconnectivity to change the ways they think about hiring and tracking performance. So why is hiring a critical area to explore? Essentially, human capital is expensive and it's difficult to manage. I think the reason a lot of us are here is that managing is tough and they need talented people to do it. So there's a lot of opportunity there to add value. And kind of existing measures or existing methods of measuring talent are mostly backwards facing, and there's a lot of kind of policies that have existed over a period of time in hiring and recruiting that are just standards without people really thinking about them and without being as data driven. So as of 2014, only 4% of HR departments used any form of predictive analytics when they were making hiring decisions. That number has ticked up a bit as this stuff has gotten more popular and more widespread, but still, I think Nick had a chart the other day that was the hype curve, and there was a dot on there for something around hiring or talent analytics that was on kind of like the front of the curve. So there's a lot more progress to be made in this space. We're still in the early days. And the third kind of interesting factor is that hyperconnectivity, really has the potential to bring a lot more data and different types of data into these kind of decisions, as opposed to what's traditionally been the mode of assessing candidates, which is, an interview, a resume, some background checks, but not really much beyond that. So I kind of broke down three major ways that hyperconnectivity is changing, the way we work with human capital, the way we think about hiring, and those are, insights, management, and mobility, and that's kind of mobility and transparency. Basically, how much workers know about prospective companies and how much prospective companies can understand about workers and the talent they're looking for. So starting with insights, I drew an analogy to kind of the traditional model of testing. So you take a small sample and try to derive some hypotheses, some predictions based off that. So that picture there is of the NFL Combine, which I'm a sports fan, so that's kind of what I'm used to doing with analogies. But it's kind of a testing process for prospective NFL players. And it was designed in the 1970s to kind of provide a baseline of data for coaches that were looking to assess talent. So that's kind of the traditional view of how you think about talent and hiring and recruiting. The device on the right I have pictured here, if anyone's heard of the company Catapult Sports, what it is it is a GPS-enabled sensor that measures position, speed, acceleration, all this different kind of data, and you attach it to a player when they're at practice or on the field. And essentially what's really interesting about it is that it builds a set of normative data so you can understand what looks normal for that player. And they've been able to show with this device that when you get aberrations in that data, that's predictive of a potential for injury. So if you're a coach or if you're assessing a player, you can get in there and prevent them from injuring themselves if they get tired in practice and you start to see aberrations. So the idea kind of here is that, is there a potential for something like this or approaches like this in the business world? Can you get access to kind of a wider range of richer data and build normative data sets and be able to have better predictive analytics on how different people you're looking to hire will perform? So you have a larger sample, richer data set, and it also becomes harder to game. So one of the interesting things about the Combine is, NFL players will spend a ton of money, or prospective NFL players will spend, $15,000, $20,000 preparing for the Combine because, as with many tests, it responds to preparation. Whereas you take a big data approach and you're kind of taking daily measurements, it becomes a lot harder to do that. So the second way that hyperconnectivity is kind of changing the scene is management. And I think I wanted to draw the connection here between, in order to effectively assess talent coming in, you have to understand what makes a good worker in the first place. And that's a really, really tough question to solve and crack. This is a quote from the Korn Ferry Institute basically saying that a lot of companies are kind of diving into analytics without understanding what makes a good worker in the first place. So this is kind of going to be an ongoing challenge, and I'll talk a little bit later in some of the case studies about ways that different companies are approaching this. But really, it's important to have both sides of the coin. In order to know what you're looking for, you need to know what creates success within your organization. And then finally, the other kind of factor I wanted to tie in here is mobility. So we're seeing an increasingly mobile workforce, And at this point today, there's a lot more sources for information, both for prospective job seekers and companies looking for talent, than there were before. And there's an increased transparency. You can go on Quora or Glassdoor or LinkedIn and get a much deeper sense of what it's actually like to work at a given company. And conversely, companies can look at you and understand a lot more about where you come from, what you're doing, what talents you have. There's a good outcome to this, which means that companies and workers kind of find the right match more easily because they have access to more data. And there's probably also ways that can be abused and are kind of dangerous and we need to avoid. So some best practices for talent analytics. I'll go over these quickly because I want to kind of get to the examples that I have in terms of case studies. I talked a little bit about linking management, incentives, analytics, and infrastructure. So you really have to have the full chain to get the full benefit. There are a couple, academic studies I looked into that said when you have all three of these things, properly aligned incentives, the analytics, and kind of the IT infrastructure to support it, you get better kind of returns on investment than if you have, just a pairwise interaction or two of the three. Second, we're still not at the point where you can use analytics in a vacuum. There's a lot of other factors, and especially if you're going to be, in a place where human interaction occurs, it's probably good to have human interaction in the recruiting process. You can't just rely on the algorithm to tell you what to do. Third, focus on factors that are actually predictive. And this is an area where some of the data that's been coming out has actually been interesting. Google is an example of a company that's kind of used data that they've gathered in terms of worker performance to inform their recruiting process. So they used to be famous for having brain teasers in their interviews. And they actually cut that out because they found that success on the brain teaser section of the interview had no predictive value. It didn't tell you if you were going to be good at Google, bad at Google, and so on and so forth. And the reason they sussed out the reason that people use that stuff in interviews is it actually just makes the interviewer feel smarter and better, but it doesn't tell you anything about the candidate. The fourth, employ systems which benefit users across the value chain. So this is the idea that, in order for these approaches to be successful, all the parties have to feel like they get some value out of it. It's not just the companies, but also the job seekers. So I'm sure people are familiar with kind of Facebook. During job searches, a lot of people will shut down their Facebook account or change their name. And it's the idea that a company might get value from Facebook in terms of being able to dig in more to who you are and what you do, but you're not getting value out of that interaction, so you're not going to engage in that system. And then finally, guarding personal data is critical. We've had a couple talks this year about data security, and especially as you start to pull in more detailed personal data and sensitive personal data, you have to be very careful about what you use and if you're protecting it adequately. So a couple interesting case studies that I'll get into. I won't probably go through all of these, but I'll touch on a couple. Google's probably the company that's been pushing the farthest ahead on this whole spectrum. If any of you have heard of Laszlo Bock, he's probably the only kind of like HR director you'll read about in popular media, which is interesting and also kind of a question, will that change going forward as this stuff becomes more valuable? But in any case, Google had a big project called Project Oxygen that essentially was trying to figure out how to better predict manager value and if managers were valuable and what makes a good manager. And that's kind of then bred a lot more work around talent acquisition and hiring and using data to kind of guide that process. So Google actually has an algorithm called QDroid that during the interview process will feed questions to the interviewer that are designed to get certain pieces of data. So it'll kind of look at your resume, look at your background, figure out what gaps exist in terms of what they're looking for from that position and what information you've provided, and it will provide some kind of questions or prompts for the interviewer. So it's still kind of a human interaction, but there is a value to the algorithm that's feeding that data. So that's one example. Guild is a pretty cool company as well. This is a company, it's a startup that basically assesses engineers, and if for companies looking for kind of a freelance developer, it'll provide a database and a whole kind of search list of them. But what it does is it draws in a lot of data from kind of public sources. So it'll look at a developer, it'll look at their comments and replies on sites like Stack Overflow, it'll look at GitHub and see what code they've put up, it'll kind of assess the code, it'll see how many branches there are off it, it'll look at their LinkedIn profile, and they have certain phrases that they've identified that kind of separate a really top developer from someone who's like kind of getting into it or a novice, and then it builds a score. So you can say, if I'm in DC, here's a list of 30 freelance developers, and here's the the kind of guild score for what their quality is. So it's a very interesting kind of big data approach to assessing how valuable that talent is. And then kind of more farther afield, there's a company, Sociometric Solutions down in Boston, that's doing a lot of work around, how do you collect data in the workplace around how people interact, and maybe, eventually use that as a predictive, to feed into your predictive model. So they have a sensor that fits on kind of your badge, your ID badge. And I'm not sure any companies actually use this technology today, but it will measure your position in a room. It'll tell who you're facing, from the company. And it can also measure if you're leaning in. If I'm talking to you, am I talking to you like this? Am I talking to you like this? It'll measure your volume of voice, your tone of voice. So you can start to build a data set around how people within a company interact and the quality of those interactions, which is pretty fascinating stuff. And I think that's probably farther down the line, but you can start to see how all these sources of data would feed into a better sense of what's generating value at your company. How do you shape policies? How do you recruit for people that will kind of drive higher performance? And the risk, I'll just touch quickly on Cornerstone On Demand, which bought a company called Evolve that did some predictive analytics for Xerox. And they were kind of looking for call center workers and trying to figure out what factors, determine whether someone will stay on after 6 months or not. Because retention is a huge issue at call centers. And it's very expensive to keep having people leave and then rehire and rehire. But one of the risks is that as you use the predictive models, you have to be careful about what the outcomes are. So they had a predictive model that said, distance to work was a huge factor in retention, which you can imagine, but they had to turn that kind of piece of the predictive model off, because what it ended up doing was discriminating essentially against people of a certain ethnic background who were in a certain neighborhood that was a certain distance away. So there's a lot of kind of workplace discrimination factors that can be potential risks when using this kind of technology, and you have to be very, very careful about how you use it.